For the Life of the World is a production of the Yale Center for Faith and Culture. For more information, visit faith.yale.edu. Before we dive in this week, just a quick thank you for listening to this week's episode. And if you happen to be new and you haven't subscribed yet, we'd welcome you to subscribe in your favorite podcast listening app, and we'd be honored to be a part of your week. And we also have a request for those of you who've been with us for a while. We hope the show continues to grow and reach new listeners, and you can help with that. Sharing in your social feed, forwarding an email, giving us a rating and review in Apple Podcasts. Each of these things are just so valuable to growing a podcast and hoping to add to our community of listeners. So thank you for considering how you can support us today. Hope you enjoyed today's episode.
Difference between existential certainty on all or the vast majority of things and versus existential humility. That there are some things that we don't know. There is some a need to approach the world and to approach the great questions of life, not just theologically, but the complexities of politics and culture with an attitude of humility and openness. There were elements of sort of this, the far left, the illiberal left, the cancel culture left, whatever you want to call it, where you're beginning to see the closing off of people to dissent, the closing off of people to disagreement, which I had seen and I had seen growing up in a fundamentalist Christian community. I saw it with my own eyes and I thought, oh, I recognize this religion. And then on the right, I was noting how there's this almost syncretistic molding together in some quarters of Trumpism and faith. And some of the unbelievable over-the-top devotion to Donald Trump is sort of a man who cannot fail. He can only be failed. And you see that a lot in sort of the devoted quarters of the MAGA right. And I was noting that this is a negative development because it's two competing tribes of existential certainty who are closing themselves off to debate and disagreement, contesting in American culture and American politics.
This is For the Life of the World, a podcast about seeking and living a life worthy of our humanity. I'm Evan Rosa with the Yale Center for Faith and Culture. This week, we've got Miroslav Volf in conversation with David French. It seems like for years now, we've been thinking and hearing America has never been more divided, never more polarized, never more tribalized, never more fractured. Now, that's a bleak view of life right now, and probably too rosy a view of the past. But neither is it a bad read. That's what we're hitting on the show today. As a conservative political commentator and lawyer who was publicly against Trump in 2016 and after, and publicly for decency, civility, and pluralism in American life, David French has a new book coming out in September called Divided We Fall, America's Secession Threat and How to Restore Our Nation. David currently writes for The Dispatch. In this conversation, which I moderate, David and Miroslav discuss the politically and culturally polarized America, the resurgence of cultural struggle, if not outright culture war, seeing fundamentalist political religion on both the right and the left, forgiveness versus cancellation, and how our view of human persons affects that public conversation, the bearing of personal morality at an individual level on how we seek social justice, and finally, how political theology can make a difference now, the rest of this year, and it's been a year, and the future of American life. This was a really interesting conversation to be a part of. I'm grateful, and thank you for listening. David, Miroslav, glad to have you guys here. David, thank you so much for joining us. We're really glad to have you on the show here.
Well, thanks so much for having me. I'm honored to be here.
Yeah, it's great to have you, David.
I thought I'd start today by, each of you have public faith as a matter of deep significance. It's important to both of you. And I thought we could just start by just getting some personal takes. Public faith today in America, given the pandemic and the question of reopening the economy and now schools, and now there's empty baseball stadiums with teams playing. Unless you're like establishment left or a Trump supporter, it seems like the norm is now like disillusionment, and it's probably some low grade anxiety. And I'm just wondering, like, with the need to find a flourishing life in a United States,
right?
We need that possibility. I wonder if each of you could sort of give like your current mindset on this?
I look out there and I just see a lot of despair and confusion. And, I'm reminded of a survey recently done by the group More in Common, which has really taken this close look at American polarization. And it discovered this group of people it calls the exhausted majority. And this is before the pandemic and before the George Floyd murder. And it was betraying a weariness in approach to American life, just almost like a sense of resignation that things are, especially in this political sphere, are bad and they don't know how to make it better. And then I think the pandemic has only enhanced that feeling. And so it's maybe not necessarily an exhausted majority in the United States as much as there's just a despairing majority in the United States right now. And what is so hard, I think, and this is exactly the point where faith should be breaking through. This is exactly the point where the church, for example, should be sort of raising its banner as, a beacon of compassion and hope. And what's so incredibly unfortunate is that these issues of faith are now so wrapped up in our culture war and the political campaign that it's hard even for faith to break through and provide hope right now. And in many ways, faith provides pain. And so I, as somebody who speaks about these issues a lot, you sometimes feel like you're kind of fighting a two-front war. On the one hand, looking at Americans saying there is a light in this darkness, and then on the other hand, turning back to the faith community and saying stop being so fearful and angry as you confront this modern time.
Yeah, these two last words that you said, fearful and angry, that's what came to my mind as I'm observing the scene. And maybe you're looking at kind of middle majority. I may be looking at two ends of the spectrum, and there's quite a bit of anger there. And hopelessness also that you mentioned. And my question was always, how does I look at the faith itself as this incredible precious resource, as a jewel, and somehow frustrated that faith that is so life-giving has been hijacked, that it can't speak in its own voice, that it's always refracted in ways that domesticated, that pull it into the kind of a preset, almost like a herd mentalities. And this instrumentalization of faith is what troubles me, and what I'm praying and thinking, how does one break out of that?
Yeah. David, you've got a new book coming out,
Yes.
Divided We Fall. And you're summoning us, as we understand it. It's coming out in September, but you're summoning the courage to reconcile political differences and address what each side sees as a sort of threat or even violent, sometimes opposition from the other tribe. And Miroslav recently pointed out that the term, and you just used it, the term culture war seems to now apply again. And I know he's got some things to say about that, but for you, why this book? Why now? Is it tied to a certain event scheduled for early November?
No, I actually started writing the book, about a year and a half ago. And I'd been thinking about this for a long time and sort of put preliminary thoughts on paper, even as early as 2017. And the basic thesis is that there is no significant cultural, political, religious, or social force that is pulling us together more than it's pushing us apart. That we're in the grips of a lot of tidal forces, and politics is only one of them. It's not the only one that is pushing us apart. We have this big sort, for example, that's been, there's a book by that name that was printed, 15 years ago now. And all of the trends that were outlined there have only really exacerbated, that say we now are less likely to live around people that we disagree with than we have been in generations. That a huge percentage of us live in these so-called landslide counties where one candidate or another wins by more than 20 points. So we're less likely to be around people of differing minds. The secularization of the United States has not been a phenomenon that's been happening uniformly across all geographic regions. And in fact, in some ways, America is becoming both more secular and more religious, in the sense that the most religious elements of American society are remaining quite strong and sometimes even growing, and also, again, geographically concentrated. I can go on and on through the various, the subdivision of our media, even down to the subdivision of the entertainment that we watch, so that Americans are really beginning to live quite separate lives. And it isn't a separate lives that are marked necessarily by all that much affection for the diversity of this country. It's much more marked by a lot of hostility and fear against political opponents. And I'm just, we can never take for granted the continued existence of a continent-sized, multi-ethnic, multi-faith, geographically diverse nation that we can't just take for granted that we can continue to rip at the social fabric and that it will all stay together. And so what I'm trying to do in the book is sort of issue a clarion call warning that says, look, we all are aware of polarization, and what we're trying to do as political partisans often is end polarization by the absolute defeat of our opponents. And instead, why can't we deal with polarization by embracing pluralism? And I feel like that's the only way through. I do not think that we have a country where one side or the other can crush and grind the other one into dust. And the very effort to try to do so is only going to fracture us more.
That's interesting what you say, David, about crushing the other group to the ground. As I was looking at the United States, I was wondering whether culture war applies in a new sense. I think when James Hunter wrote the book, it would seem to me that what he had in mind was less something like culture war, although that's what the title of his book, but more something like struggle. And of course, the culture war or culture struggle goes back to Germany in the last century before last, which was kind of the struggle between the government of the Kingdom of Prussia and the Catholic Church. But the term that was used was Kulturkampf, which is a cultural struggle, and it was not used Kulturkrieg. And I think there's an important distinction to be made between these two. In war, we have enemies. In struggle, we have contestants. Yes. In war, one enemy wants to eliminate the other. In struggle, each contestant wants to overcome their opponents, and the struggle might continue, and we might continue to be opponents, but nonetheless, there's interest in the existence of the opponents is not an issue. So, and even Nietzsche, when he used his kind of terminology of agon and contestation, he was thinking of it not in terms of elimination, but in terms of really strong contest of strength in some ways. And so, did I hear you rightly that you think that today we are more in a culture war than we are in a culture struggle?
Well, that's a fantastic distinction, and I'll tell you why I'm raising the warning, some of the warning bells about culture war. I'll give you just a great example from the debate that took over much of the right last summer in 2019, when there was this essay written in First Things called "Against David Frenchism."
I've read some of it.
And one of the key indictments against me, and one of the key points of agreement by many of the people who were opposed to my ideas and my cultural and political philosophy, was that I failed to see politics as war and enmity. And that was a key, and that has been really ever since 2015, 2016, a key point it's a key break point between me and much of the rest of the American right, is that I do not see the sort of, to use the phrase from one of the influential essays written in the run-up to the 2016 election, I do not see that we are in a Flight 93 scenario where essentially the fate of the republic itself hinges upon any given election, that Hillary Clinton would not end America. And, when you're talking to predominantly blue audiences, for example, and you say, hey, I took the position that Hillary Clinton's election wouldn't end America, people look at you like, who would think that? But that was an absolute burning sense of conviction among millions of Americans that the United States would end if Hillary Clinton was to win. I just had a debate with Eric Metaxas, and he said Joe Biden would end America. And so that's when I'm saying I'm using the word culture war, although certainly, thankfully, we're not in a shooting conflict. But it is something more than the normal range of give and take. I win some, I lose some of political debate. There's a sense of existential crisis amongst millions of Americans.
So existential threat, even for continued existence of the way of life. Yeah.
Yes,
I think that it's that kind of existential threat that often pushes groups back into fundamentalism.
Yeah.
And recently, David, you argued in one of your pieces for the Dispatch, you can understand a lot more about what's going on in U.S. politics if you have some experience, personal experience with fundamentalism. So for both of you here, how is fundamentalism tied to the cultural struggle today? And what kind of fundamentalisms, because there's not just one, do you observe operating on the left and the right and in both theological and political contexts?
Yeah, that's a great question. So just to briefly sort of define my terms, I wasn't trying to write some sort of scholarly inquiry into the various branches of fundamentalism versus evangelicalism on the Christian in the Christian world. What I was trying to do was, I think there's a difference between religion broadly understood and fundamentalist religion, and the short version of it that because I've lived in different kinds of religious. I've been a part of different churches. I grew up in a very fundamentalist church, and I do not belong to a fundamentalist church now. And one thing that I indicated as a difference is there is a difference between existential certainty on all or the vast majority of things and versus existential humility. That there are some things that we don't know. There is some a need to approach the world and to approach the great questions of life, not just theologically, but the complexities of politics and culture with an attitude of humility and openness. And what I saw and what I was talking about in my piece is there were elements of sort of the far left, the illiberal left, the cancel culture left, whatever you want to call it, where you're beginning to see the closing off of people to dissent, the closing off of people to disagreement, which I had seen and I had seen growing up in a fundamentalist Christian community. I saw it with my own eyes and I thought, oh, I recognize this. And this isn't just religion, because a lot of people critique the, people on the left and the right who are ostensibly secular but seem very devoted to politics. They say, well, politics is your religion. But no, I mean, it was something even beyond that. It was like as a fundamentalist religion. And then on the right, I was noting how there's this almost syncretistic molding together in some quarters of Trumpism and faith. And I pointed to things, for example, like the choir of First Baptist Dallas singing a hymn that they wrote called Make America Great Again. And some of the unbelievable over-the-top devotion to Donald Trump as sort of a man who cannot fail. He can only be failed. And you see that a lot in sort of the devoted quarters of the MAGA right. And I was noting that this is a negative development because it's two competing tribes of existential certainty who are closing themselves off to debate and disagreement, contesting in American culture and American politics, and fits in with some of what we just talked about this sense of culture war as opposed to struggle.
One of the features of fundamentalism is a certain kind of lack of porousness to anything that might come from the outside. I have experienced that during the war in former Yugoslavia. Obviously, every time you granted anything good is on the other side, you were already betraying the cause of your own group. And so it kind of ended up exacerbating the difference and closing things more down. The same impression I had also in my Muslim-Christian dialogues, and especially after I wrote the book, The Muslims and Christians Worship the Same God, called Allah. And I would sometimes speak, and in the audience, I'd have this various folks, and you can almost identify the unporous ones, right? There's a kind of certain demeanor that they exemplified, and there's absolutely nothing you can do to kind of get to them. And in some ways, it's almost like they have this fortress that's built, and if you take only one of the stones in that fortress, the whole thing, they're afraid, is going to collapse. And this kind of fragility, robustness of commitment, but fragility, was to me really very, very troubling. And some of it you can see also in America today.
That's a great point. When I speak to audiences, almost by a person's countenance as they're sitting there, you can understand and see their openness. That's a fascinating point. I've seen that myself as well.
You can script the question they're going to ask you.
You can indeed.
I mean, this sort of brings up the importance of like moral and intellectual virtues, and thinking through the lens of character traits and character. And Dave, both of you were deeply concerned about essentially like what is a lack of like personal commitment, personal holiness, character, and especially with respect to Christian engagement in public. There's previous generations where that sort of morality and personal code and personal commitment to that was seen as more important.
Yeah, last Sunday I wrote a piece that a lot of people responded to, talking about what the extent to which some of these conspiracy theories are being spread through the Christian community, these coronavirus conspiracy theories. And I just listed some that I've seen in my own social media feed from my own Christian friends, like the Plandemic video, claiming this pandemic was planned. It's kind of a self-explanatory title. Rampant rumors of government officials artificially inflating everything from death tolls to positive test results, that there's, microchips in the alleged Gates vaccine, that all of these lockdowns weren't really based on a virus, but they're trying to destroy the Trump economy. And what struck me was that I grew up in a church. There's not a time I remember when I wasn't in church. I was born into a Christian family. We went to church multiple times a week, and people would be surprised to know, growing up in an American evangelical and first fundamentalist and evangelical church, that you didn't get training in sort of how does a Christian interact as a political being in the way that we had Sunday school lessons and seminars and workbooks and speeches and guest speakers and retreats about everything from a Christian husband. What is a Christian husband like? What is a Christian wife like? What does it mean to be a Christian parent? What does it mean to be a Christian in the workplace? What does it mean to be a Christian on the athletic field? I heard more about being a good Christian athlete than what it meant to be a Christian in the body politic. And the instruction was basically about issues. A Christian in the body politic is concerned with these issues. I didn't hear about how we are the character that we bring into that space, that incredibly important cultural space. And so I was just thinking about, I read the Westminster Larger Catechism's explanation of the Ninth Commandment and how it requires, and it talks about in its explanation, that the Ninth Commandment is much more than just a admonition of do not lie. It also asks for a charitable esteem of our neighbors. We're supposed to love and desire and rejoice in their good names, sorrowing for and covering of their infirmities, freely acknowledging of their gifts and graces, defending their innocence, a ready receiving of a good report, an unwillingness to admit of an evil report. Does anything like that sound like American political discourse? And does anything like that sound like American political discourse, but from Christians? And so it just made me realize we have this huge gap in our instruction as a Christian community about the way in which we interact as political beings in a political culture.
I think about it, and I think the table around which I grew up, with my father refusing to say anything negative about anybody who wasn't around the table. And if we later, when we grew up, if we kind of felt free to just, talk about people, what's the good conversation around the table, unless you can criticize somebody, right? He would just gently remove himself from the table without saying anything, because we were already grown up. And this kind of internal integrity and care for the good name of another person, as you have mentioned from Westminster Catechism. It seems to me that's when I read what you were writing about that issue, other issues as well. It seems to me like that gives a different twist to the question that personal is political. That our internal personal virtues turn out to have significant political implications. And I don't know what... So in some ways, I see that we as Christians in general, not just in political sense, there's a kind of a weakness there even before, that we feel ourselves more as members of a crowd. Our own crowd, or to use Nietzschean term, as members of a herd, and act as herd animals, rather than standing kind of as independent human beings before with resources of faith, and then deciding how we are going to act. And almost like a spirituality and faith has become a resource in a struggle, right, rather than something ultimate that actually has to be respected as a mode of being in the world, rather than simply as a question of how do I use it in order to achieve certain ends that have been set outside the faith itself.
And one thing to build on that is that I couldn't agree more. And I would also say that what is interesting about the faith gap and the theology gap around politics that I've seen that's completely distinct from any other area. Like if you went to a Christian person who's grown up in the church, his business is struggling, and he might have to close his business and lose his house and take his kids out of school. I mean, catastrophic economic loss has real ramification in human lives. And you said to him, if you just bring in a partner and this partner will rescue your business through consumer fraud, he would say, no, I'm not going to do that. I trust God will take care of me. Or if a person is in real pain in their marriage and you say, well, one way to introduce some joy in your life is, an adultery and that indulging that chemistry you feel with, your colleague or whatever. It would say, no, absolutely not. And yet what you often see in the political realm is this incredibly results-oriented thinking. You're supposed to bless those who persecute you, love your enemies, and, be kind, be decent. And then someone will say, well, wait, we tried that and it didn't work. But that's not the calculus that's applied to other areas of life. Almost reflexively, that's not the calculus applied. And so these commands, which, by the way, were articulated in a time when the political authorities would do a lot worse to you than drag you on Twitter, are not optional. They're not conditional. And yet we treat them often in the world of politics as if they are. Well, we tried decency. His name was Mitt Romney. That didn't work. But that's not the way, that's not the theology that's applicable to a human being interacting, a Christian person interacting in any sphere of life, including politics.
How much do you think it's connected to a kind of Christian nationalism where Christian faith and nation are so closely intertwined and they depend on one another, and so that you've got, it's almost like care for the Christian faith itself, or something that's ultimate, that's at stake here, and therefore I treat it differently than my marriage. Almost, it's there's something holy almost that we're facing.
That's a great question. I think not in everyone certainly, but there is a whiff of almost nationalistic idolatry in a way, and it's not just a dedication to the United States of America as a existing, continuing to exist entity. It's a dedication to a particular vision of the country, a particular type of patriotism, sort of this real America. There's a sense of what is real America, and it's distinct from the vision of America that people on the left side of the spectrum will have, and there is this extraordinary sense of devotion that doesn't strike me as in proportionate scriptural bounds. And I think one of the areas where you saw that emerge a little bit was the unbelievably strong reaction to football players kneeling rather than standing for the flag. That hit a lot of people in a very, very visceral place. Even people who would sit there and decry cancel culture left and right and make, and mock Silicon Valley for its snowflake sensibility, or the campus for its snowflake sensibility, were roaring their approval when Donald Trump said, "Fire them." And because it touched something very deep, I feel like inappropriately deep. And I do think that that's a part of the background here.
That's interesting. I'm thinking of Stanley Hauerwas, that the goddess nation seems in critical settings to be much more powerful and demand much greater loyalties than any invisible God, creator of the universe, can, which is obviously deeply problematic.
Yes.
I wonder if there's another connection to draw out from a related topic here. When you see the fundamentalism that arises from either a sort of nationalist fundamentalism or a tribal fundamentalism, either on the left or the right, that it's got a marked distinction from the fundamentalism that a lot of us grew up with, that was mostly with reference to Christian fundamentalism, and that's at least a modicum of forgiveness. That while Christian fundamentalism has, and as you brought up earlier, David, it's resulted in a variety of pain and suffering for many people, and yet it still had a category for forgiveness. And when you see the fundamentalisms portrayed in political public life, it looks like that's noticeably less available.
Peter Beinart at The Atlantic wrote a fascinating essay several years ago where he was talking about, for a long time, the left had longed for a post-Christian right under the presumption that the problem with the American right was the religious right, and that if you shed if the American right shed that intolerant Christianity, it would become a more tolerant entity. It would become maybe more culturally, more culturally moderate, more open-minded. And what Beinart said is, and Ross Douthat has also made this point, which I think is right, is, in part, there are elements of the post-Christian right that have emerged, and it's not what you wanted it to be. And part of the reason is that shedding of that very, we all know that commands like, love your enemies, bless those who persecute you, or commands to forgive, are often seem to be more observed in the breach But if you take a worldview and you shed it and you take away from it even the aspiration of forgiveness or the sort of the aspiration of kindness, what you're left with is something, more profoundly ugly. And on the extreme ends, we've seen this with the rise of the alt-right, which has is often it's an either explicitly godless or more pagan-oriented movement that centers its meaning and purpose around its whiteness. And it is a vicious, ugly, horrible, evil presence in the American community. And then Peter Beinart went on and he said, look, I'm even seeing that as, and I'm not, to be clear, I'm not comparing the alt-right to the people I'm talking about now. He says on the left, I'm even seeing that those elements that have sort of shed the traditional sort of Christianity of like the John L. Lewis civil rights movement are more harsh, that there is something that is being lost as parts of the social activist and social justice left shed some of the religious roots of the social justice left, that there is something that is harsher and more intolerant that is emerging. And I do think that's right. I do think that that's one of the things that we're seeing is that post-Christian or post-religious activism, both on the left and the right, has a harsher edge, in part because it doesn't have the aspiration of forgiveness so much. I believe it was Michelle Goldberg at the New York Times had an interesting formulation. She said there's a fundamental difference between a movement that's looking for heretics and a movement that's looking for converts. And what you will see is on the political extremes, movements that are spending a lot of time looking for heretics and less time looking for converts.
Oh, that's very fascinating. So, in a sense, we're between. We either tolerate or we condemn, and there is nothing in between. And it seems to me that act of forgiveness is right there lodged between the two. Forgiveness entails a certain kind of condemnation, but at the same time, it doesn't let the transgression, wrongdoing, and consequences of wrongdoing rest on the person, provided, of course, that there is repentance that accompanies that, and that seems to be lost. And I'm wondering. You mentioned a loss of Christian faith, and I think and what consequences it might have on harshness of our culture, and I think forgiveness may be just one such a case, because in order to forgive, you kind of need to distinguish between the person and the deed that person has committed. You need to be able to kind of peel off from the person the deed, the wrongdoing that sticks to that person. Unless you're willing to peel that off, you can't quite forgive. You cannot accept the person because you constantly see that deed stuck onto them. And we have this idea that a human person is such that kind of a sum of their deeds and their failings and maybe way they internalize them. But if that's who the person is, if person is not somebody larger than that, then of course you can't forgive. You can't you're undoing the person if you want to do anything like forgiveness. So this idea that a person is larger than the sum of their deeds, that the person kind of exists as an entity from which you can separate the wrongdoing, that seems to have been lost for us. And in extreme situation, obviously, that results in a very vicious types of behaviors. But sometimes I see even in ordinary situations, we find ourselves in a difficulty as to have reasons to forgive a person because you can't make that distinction.
One of the things we're seeing that's connected to this is that, especially if you're in the political, if you're in the political discourse in this country, a confession of error is seen not as a sign of humility or perhaps even not just a sign of humility, but a sign of personal growth, something to be welcomed and applauded. Often a confession of error is seen as a sign of weakness. to be pounced upon and exploited. That if you are, say, on Team Red and you said, you know what, there's something I long thought as part of Team Red that I now know is not right. I don't think that's right. And here's why, and I'm sorry I got it wrong, and I'm going to try to do better. You're immediately seen as a weak figure who is trying to kowtow to people on the other side and worthy of being treated with contempt by people on your team. And it's hard to imagine a culture. And again, a lot of this is amongst the people who are sort of hyper online and hyper engaged in American political culture. It's harder to think of a culture more calculated to discourage humility and discourage expressions of forgiveness than the one that we are creating right now.
A lot of our conversation has been about political or even economic theology. And one of the visions of the Yale Center for Faith and Culture and Miroslav's recent work is a theology that makes a difference. And David, you even recently pointed this out, that all too many Christians, is a quote, do not possess any form of political theology beyond a commitment to a certain set of issues. You say also, we do not spend nearly enough time learning how to live as political beings. So how do you see political theology making a difference this coming year?
Can I be really pessimistic in response to that?
Yes, you can.
Okay. I think the absence of a political theology is going to make a profound difference in this coming year. I think you're going to see an escalating round of fear, an escalating fear and anger. I don't see a way through that for right now. And I think that escalating fear and anger is going to be in partly due to this lack of a political theology, a lack of understanding the extent to which, God is sovereign over nations. And instead there's a sense that if we, through the sweat of our brow right now, fail to accomplish what we want to accomplish politically, everything we love will be lost. And which is I believe abdicates, it neglects and ignores the true extent of God's sovereignty over the world and the true extent of God's care and love for his people, and for not just his people, but for people, those created in his image. And I feel like we're losing sight of that, and it is raising the temperature of American religious discourse and raising the amount of fear, which quite frankly then compounds a lot of the culture's rejection of faith. Because are you going to look at this incredibly fearful group of human beings, this incredibly angry and fearful group of human beings, and say, oh, they've got this figured out? This is the community I want to join. What you then have is this vicious cycle. It's the fear and anger alienates the church from the culture. And then as the church is alienated from the culture, there's more fear and anger. And you just get into this incredible vicious cycle. And so it's going to be absolutely vital for there to be voices to say, fear not. Do not be angry. Fear not. We can see, I keep going back to that. We have to get to a point where we re-embrace Micah 6:8. And Micah 6:8 is, what does the Lord require of you, O man? What is good? It's to seek justice, love mercy, and walk humbly. And seeking justice, that's the part, it's all easy now. That's what you do on Twitter with hashtags, right? And with your political anger. But you also love mercy. You are also merciful to your political opponents. You are kind to them. You love your enemies. You bless those who persecute you. And then you walk humbly. You'll realize, I don't know all the answers. I don't know everything. And until we reconnect with that sort of like three-pronged mission statement, I feel like our fear and anger is going to isolate us more and then cause more fear and anger and more isolation.
Miroslav, closing thoughts?
Well, I mean, I think our conversation has circled quite consistently around the question of what kind of life is the life that God has in mind for us. What kind of life is it that we can live in today's world as followers of Jesus Christ and as those to whom the first order of allegiance is to that God of Jesus Christ, is to Jesus Christ, and everything else aligns around it. Only then will we care for justice, true justice, mercy, and walk humbly before our God. I think, and I think that's one of the great challenges of our time. It's not immediately political, but it has ramification for politics, and that is to take seriously in all of our activities what Apostle Paul talks about: life that is truly life. Once that is in place, I think we can then talk about also Christian political vision. Ryan, my colleague, and I have published 4 years ago a little book on public faith in action, where we talk about character and commitments, and then 23 issues or stuff like that. It's all about how does one discern what to do in terms of politics, and obviously there's very little interest unless one thinks that Christian faith ought to define all the aspects of one's lives, rather than you act simply out of particular interest for your own group. And that's, in a sense, what I'm hearing you in this last comments saying as well. Kind of primacy of this concern for justice, for mercy, for humility before God.
David French, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks so much for having me. I really loved this conversation.
David, thank you. This is very, very good. We should continue it.
Oh, I would love that. I would really enjoy that. Thank you.
Thank you both. For the Life of the World is a production of the Yale Center for Faith and Culture at Yale Divinity School. This episode featured theologian Miroslav Volf with political commentator David French. I'm Evan Rosa, and I edited and produced this show. For more information, visit us online at faith.yale.edu. New episodes drop every Saturday, and we hope you'll subscribe to the show wherever you listen to podcasts. We are delighted you're listening, and we've been hearing some very helpful and thoughtful feedback in our reviews on Apple Podcasts. If you have time today, even right now, would you go into our Apple Podcasts page and leave us a review and a rating? It really helps the show get out to even more listeners, and it gives us a sense for what's worth talking about, who we should invite to talk about it, and then how to deliver it. Thank you, listener friends. We'll be back with more soon.